It is now recording. Great.
Awesome. So Andrew, thanks for agreeing to speak to the members at SBC. We're all really interested in understanding what you're up to recently and kind of what exactly are the things that we don't know about the census, right? How does it compare across different countries? What is the history? For SBC members, Andrew and I used to work together at the World Bank for a while when the Innovation Labs was a real thing. And I've been kind of following his current work and invited him to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Yeah, so I'll cover off some of that in the talk, and then maybe in Q&A I can answer anything that I haven't really addressed because the talk is pretty short. We'll see. So yeah, this is my first book. I'm not a writer professionally. I mean, maybe I am now, but I wouldn't have called myself that in the past. And it was published about 2 months ago. And as I was just saying before, I haven't given that many talks because of COVID and social distancing and so on. So I really appreciate you inviting me to talk about the book, which I'm always excited to do. It's called The Sum of the People: How the Census Has Shaped Nations from the Ancient World to the Modern Age. But I kind of want to explain my motivation for writing it a little bit. I think it helps understand where I'm coming from. So yeah, in my last job, when I first met Kathy, I was a data scientist at the World Bank, and in that innovation lab, I was working on this project about big data, the big data program. And so, that's something that is a little bit faddish and has maybe gone out of fashion talking about big data, but we were thinking about things like satellite data and location services on apps and cell phone pings and web traffic and all those kinds of things, and how we could use those to understand, global development and people in lower income countries and so on. And that was really fun. It was exciting, but data like that has a lot of caveats, right? It's really complicated to use correctly. A lot of people won't be represented in it. The way in which people interact with technology and behave and change as technology progresses changes the interpretation of that data. So working with that kind of stuff gave me a lot of respect for traditional data and survey data in particular, and really in particular in the population census, which is this kind of long-running, longitudinal survey data. We're on the 24th census in the US now, which happens every 10 years. So it's really a long-lived thing. And it's also interesting from that point of view, because for a long time, up until I would say about the middle of the 20th century, the census was really what you would think of as big data. It was the largest data sets that you could really put together and that people would try to process and understand. So it's kind of interesting as well from a history of technology point of view. So I started researching and eventually writing this book, and it has a kind of thesis, which is that the process of counting people has actually been this kind of important force in shaping societies. But I'm not really going to speak about that so much today as sort of take advantage of the fact that I think you're a kind of tech-savvy Bay Area audience. So I want to talk a bit about that technology aspect, which is another thread that runs through the book, and talk a little bit about how we've counted people through history, because I find that really fascinating. So let's get going. So it seems like it'd be really simple, right? Just count everybody. But it's definitely not. So before we had more advanced technology to record and then analyze and report on censuses, we did some really basic things. So the earliest kinds of examples of counting with things, and I promised in the title of this talk that I gave that I would start with Moses. So let's start with Moses. There's lots of censuses recorded in the Bible. There's a whole book of the Old Testament called the Book of Numbers, and that's where I get my book's title, Some of the People. Is from a quote from the Book of Numbers. But the earliest biblical example of a census procedure is in Exodus. And so I just quote a bit of that. The Lord said to Moses, "When you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he's counted. Each one who crosses over to those already counted is to give a half shekel," which is the currency, right? "The rich are not to give more than a half shekel, and the poor are not to give less when you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives. Receive the atonement money from the Israelites and use it for the service of the tent of meeting," otherwise known as the tabernacle, which was this sort of temporary portable shrine as the Israelites crossed the desert from the Exodus in Egypt. And so this is not necessarily the earliest census. There's kind of a mythology of census taking in ancient China, which is sort of around the same time as traditional dating would put it, maybe 2000 BCE, if you like, but I mean the dates are really fuzzy on these sorts of things. But what I like about this census procedure is it gives you some like firm instructions on how you should take a census, but it's also giving us some indication of why you take a census, which that it's a kind of a tax collection. It's collecting these half shekels from everybody, which are going to be used for the service of the tabernacle. And it also shows some of the downside, shall we say, of ancient censuses. So in the description there, it says it'll only count people who are 20 years and older. And although it's not explicit in this census, in most of those other Old Testament censuses, it makes clear that it's only counting males as well. And that kind of indicates another aspect of census taking the ancient world, which was that it was either for, generally speaking, primarily either for tax collection, or it was for kind of conscription purposes. So either military conscription or civilian conscription for sort of civic works projects. So like irrigation systems or damming rivers or that kind of thing. And so for those purposes, it was really sort of military age men who was the population of interest for early censuses. And that's a big difference from what we have today. There are many other examples of censuses like this, some of which I give in the book, where objects are used to count people. So Herodotus, the Greek historian, gives an example of the Scythians, who are a kind of first millennium BCE people in Central Asia. And the king there asked everybody to bring an arrowhead, and those arrowheads are collected together and melted down into a monument, which indicates the wealth and the population, the power of this kingdom. So that's like the easiest way that you can take a census, but all you get is a count of people, and you're not getting any information about those people. The other example that I really like from the kind of pre-writing era, much later in history, but a similar stage of development of writing, in a sense, is the Inca quipu. And so the quipu are these knotted bundles of knotted threads. And this is a picture of it from a museum here. And this is kind of a bad depiction. It's good in the sense that you can see all the detail of what's going on here, these separate threads that are kind of joining to a central thread that's holding them all together. But this is not really how these objects would have existed in society. They wouldn't have been all spread out like this. They would have been something that people had to kind of interact with and run their fingers across and so on to read and interpret. So there's only about 1,000 of these things in museums today. And of those, about 2/3 seem to depict numerical data. And we know that because we have a basic understanding of how to decode them. And so some of those, for instance, might record the census of a village, again, for tax collection purposes. So I want to zoom in on like a little part of it. The way these work is that each knot has a number of turns in it. And so the number of turns in the knot represents the digit. So if this knot, say on the right here, has 9 turns, that would represent a digit 9. And then the position along the string represents a kind of a base 10 power. So this is like a base 10 column system of recording digits, much like we have, but in knots rather than in writing. So this might be a 9 or a 90 or a 900 or whatever, depending on where the string it is. But it's like a fairly sophisticated way of recording numerical data without writing. And so that part of it we understand, but there's a lot of other characteristics of these quipu that we don't understand. So they also use different threads, they use different colors. The knots could be knotted in a kind of left-hand way or a right-hand way, and we still don't understand what those things necessarily meant. So we only have a kind of partial understanding, but you can imagine that trying to administer an empire using this sort of record keeping would be really pretty labor intensive and quite difficult. And I find it amazing that the Inca Empire scaled to like 10 million people, maybe by some estimates, using technologies like this, right, without writing. But that brings us to writing and to another larger empire that did have that technology. So the most famous example of the census, the place that we get the word from, is the Roman census. It's a Latin word. And so the Roman census, it kind of arises early in the kind of mists of history of the Roman kingdom. And then it kind of reaches this peak during the period of the Roman Republic, so about 100 BCE. And this is the picture here is a relief that's in the Louvre. And it's disputed whether it does or doesn't, but one interpretation is that it represents a Roman census. And that was a kind of procedure they did every 5 years. And it wasn't just a counting of people for statistical purposes like we have now. It actually was used to sort of allocate somebody's position in this elaborate class hierarchy. And so each head of household, again, men, would stand up and they would talk about who was in their household in terms of the people, and then what their property was. And based on that property and the wealth that they indicated, they would be allocated a sort of a position in Roman society. And so the censor, which is the person sitting with the book, was a really powerful position in Roman society. It was right up there with the consul, who was the kind of executive head of the Roman Republic. And so that's one really famous written census. Another example that I like is the Domesday Survey. So a lot of people, you may know of the Domesday Book, which is this survey of Britain by William the Conqueror in 1086, 20 years after he conquered Britain from Normandy. And it's kind of disputed why it happened. And in fact, modern scholars will argue about whether it's a census or not, because it really focused more on property than on people. But I mean, as I was just saying with the Roman census, so did the Roman census focus on property and wealth. So for me, it counts as a census, it's fine. And I like to talk about it because for me, it illustrates this idea that the census is a technological undertaking, right? That there's really a kind of complexity in terms of information processing to the census. And the reason that that's the case in the Domesday Book is because Britain was a feudal society. So the hierarchy that was important in society was one of, nobles answering to the king and peasants answering to nobles and so on. But nobles might have landownings that were separated through the country. So you might have a parcel of land over here and one somewhere else. And these things have been won in war or granted by the king or inherited or whatever. But when they did the survey of the Domesday Book, they did it on a geographic basis. So these circuits would travel around the country, collecting information on who was there and what the property was and what the industrial and sort of agricultural output of that part of Britain was. But eventually they had to convert that into this different arrangement of data where it was arranged in the kind of feudal hierarchy. So there was this big process that would have had to happen of clerks kind of copying from original records into some intermediate form and then rearranging those pages and copying it again until eventually you got these final outputs of the collection of documents that we call the Domesday Book now. So it's this big kind of technological challenge. And now I'm just going to jump ahead 800 years, like a long time into the 19th century in America to show that like not really that much changed in terms of that challenge over that period. So there's a bunch of things on this slide, but this is kind of representative of what happened in the 1880 census. So the device at the top is something called the Seaton device. This is from the patent application, and this was the absolute height of technology, the state of the art in census tabulation in 1880. So the biggest change since the Domesday Book had been the sort of wide availability of cheap paper. But the census is still writing things down on bits of paper and then copying them to other bits of paper until eventually you have a total, for the entire country or for different states in the United States and so on. And the Seaton device is kind of fun because what it does is essentially hide columns. So I don't know if you know in Microsoft Excel, you have a bunch of columns, you select them, you right click and you say hide columns and they all just sort of collapse down. So that you can bring column H and column K and put them next to each other. And this is exactly what the Seaton device does, but it does it to paper spreadsheets. And you can kind of see how that's important if you think about how the information was arranged. So the bottom of this slide here is showing like a spreadsheet from the 19th century, right? And this is actually a copy of the 1840 schedule, which I used for a different illustration in the book. And so it's not quite, it's a little anachronistic with that Seaton device, but it illustrates the problem, which is that you're arranging information in this kind of wide format where every cell represents a total of people, and these totals are kind of in a hierarchy. So you can kind of see the hierarchy here, right? So first you have on the first line kind of race or free/enslaved status, which were the sort of relevant divisions in the 18th and 19th century US Census. And then the next line down you have sex. So each of those groups is subdivided into male and female. And the next line down, you have age. So each of those is divided into particular age categories. And then under all of that, in a box, you'll have a total, which represents the total for a household or a particular district or so on, of people who meet that category. So say of free white persons who are male, aged 40 to 50, you have a total. But what that means is that if you want to come up with a different total, you want to add up all those subtotals to a total of, say, every person who's aged 0 to 10, you have to look across a bunch of different columns and add those things up. So for 0 to 10, you would need to add all of these columns, right? The under 5 and 5 to 10 for free white men, the same for free white females, the under 10 for free colored males, under 10 for free colored females. There'd be slave columns as well to the side of this as well. So you have a bunch of these columns that are kind of spread out. And so what the Seaton device did is you fed in these really wide schedules, and it used these kind of rollers with appropriately set distances to make it so that all these columns appeared together in front of the person who was, transcribing or adding or reading or writing these columns. And so, it's pretty basic. It's slightly improved on, the 1086, what you imagine a clerk having a bunch of pages in front of them just at random trying to record numbers from different places, but it's still essentially the same process. Not a lot has really changed. Yeah, hide columns. So what changed in terms of census taking is they abandoned this wide format, right? So even by 1850, they no longer recorded information in this wide way. They recorded it in a kind of long format like you would have in a database or statistical software today. So instead of having you go to a household and there's one male aged 20 to 25 who's a free white person, so you put a 1 in that box. Instead, you would just write them down. You would write down their age, you would write down their occupation. You have a bunch of these kind of categorical variables recorded instead of just numerical subtotals. And so that was already in place in the information gathering in 1850, but it hadn't been carried through to the tabulation, the analysis. They still had to transcribe all of this to these spreadsheets and use the seeking device and so on through then. But it kind of left open this opportunity that maybe if you could carry through this different way of representing data, that you could do a much more efficient tabulation. And that became important because in 1880, the census actually took up, the tabulation of the census took up most of the decade. So there were some people who thought that it may not finish before the next census in 1890, which would really have been a disaster if you can't finish one census before you start the next one, because this thing is in the Constitution, it has to be every 10 years. And it was kind of convenient that same point in time is when electricity really became like a viable tool of engineering. And so my second favorite character in the US Census, Herman Hollerith, came along and he invented counting by machine. So this is Hollerith. He was about 21 years old at the 1880 census, which he worked on. He was an engineer. He trained at Columbia University, actually here in New York. And he encountered this tabulation problem, right? He figured there had to be a better way of doing all of this adding up of numbers of people. Maybe electricity, this new thing that he knew of, could be helpful. And he wasn't the only person who had that insight that tabulation could be improved. But I think what he really realized was that the key to it was making a sort of machine readable way of understanding, of recording data and then reading that through the process. And so what he invented was the punch card, which you see on the right-hand side of this slide here. And so these cards, which were actually used in the 1890 census, they're about like 7 by 3 inches, and they have holes punched in a grid. And each hole represents the characteristics of a particular person, and each card is one person with all of their characteristics arranged on it. And this wasn't a brand new idea. So punch cards had existed in other applications before, very few, but a couple. So there's I think called the Jacquard loom that you may have heard of, which is a weaving loom that can weave kind of complex patterns. And so those patterns were encoded using holes punched in cards and chained together. And also telegraphs at this time could punch holes in paper tape. And so you could receive a message by telegraph and then send that same message multiple times to other people using the punched tape. So Hollerith borrowed that idea really, but then he applied it to this much more general problem of kind of statistical information processing. So it's kind of fun to look at the card itself. So this is like any sort of encoded data. If you don't have like a data dictionary or something to interpret it, it's really hard to know what you're looking at. So let me give you that. This is what the 1890 census card encoded. And this is most of, but not absolutely everything that was collected on the census form. And I find it really fascinating because just by looking at the amount of area that different topics take up on the card, you kind of get some sense of what was important, right? Because something where they wanted to encode more options would be given more area. If there were more questions, it would get more of these holes punched. So these are like roughly encoded by topic, and all of these kind of greenish ones at the right-hand side of here relate to issues of kind of citizenship and alien status and naturalization and place of birth, which, were big topics in the 1890 census and have become really controversial again in the 2020 census. So you can kind of see some of the long-running, obsessions of American society, in the very format that people use to encode the census. But what is interesting about this is if you, as kind of a side, if you take away all the topics that are no longer on the census and just look at the topics that are still on the 2020 census, that's all you're left with, right? So really now we just have these kind of like relationship to the person 0 in the household, race, sex, age, marital status, and some information about where you live and your house. It's a much more reduced thing. So that's another whole story about the US Census, how it's gone from asking a lot of questions to very few questions. Anyway, so that's the card system that Hollerith came out with. The actual device he invented, you can go and see because this is in the Computer History Museum in Mountain View. This is a replica of his tabulating machine. And I think it looks really cool. I love this machine. There's kind of 3 parts to it. There's the desk is really just a work surface. And then above that, there's these dials. So there's 10 by 4 dials, 40 dials. And each one of those dials can count up to 10,000. And each of those dials is kind of wired such that it counts a particular combination of holes punched in the card. So one dial might be counting, say, males age 0 to 5. Another one might be females age 0 to 5, and so on, looking at the combinations of which holes are punched in the card. And the way the card is read is with this a thing called the press, which is the thing sitting on the right-hand side of the desk there. And that has a sort of array of sprung metal pins that kind of push down through the card once it's placed onto there. And if there's a hole, the pin will go right through, and it makes contact with a little pool of mercury below, and it closes the circuit, and so it'll move on one of those counters. So that's the kind of the key part of it. And then the thing at the right is interesting as well, because I think it reflects the way that Hollerith thought. So he, like I said, he didn't really invent any of these parts, but what he really did was see the whole system and see how you could put them together to enable the kind of logistical process that census tabulation was. So this thing at the right is something called the sorting box. And it has 26 compartments, and it's also wired to this kind of electrical logic, which is hidden here. It's behind the clocks there. And so depending on what combination of holes was punched in the card, it would open a different one of these 26 drawers. And so the operator would just automatically put the card into that drawer without having to think about where it went. And what that meant is, depending on how it was wired up, you could actually, while you were doing one round of tabulation, say sex by age, you could be pre-sorting the cards for another round of tabulation, say, I don't know, race by place of origin, say. And so, you know, it sort of indicates that Hollerith was thinking about the whole process and not just the individual steps in it. Well, yeah, the punch card has pretty much gone away now, but it lasted a really long time. So this is a 1968 computer room from the University of Michigan that I found online, along with a sort of modern punch card. The sort of fascinating part of this story is that the company that Hollerith started eventually merged with some other companies that were all making business equipment. It got renamed, and then in 1924, it became something called International Business Machines, which is IBM. And so from the very first use of punch cards for information processing in 1890, this kind of continuous thing right up into the like IBM of the mid to late 20th century that dominated information processing and mainframes and accounting equipment and so on. But yeah, I find it kind of amazing that this punch card, this idea of a cardboard thing with holes punched in it, lasted nearly a century as a sort of mainstream storage technology, when we've gone from like floppy disks to USB to Dropbox in about 20 years. So it's really like it was a really clever and long-lasting technology. But that kind of gets us up to the 2020 census near enough, because this is the first census which, and hopefully you've seen this page and clicked on this and filled out your census, but this is the first census that is really going to be in the US. It's going to be end-to-end computerized. So most people have been invited to respond online. Something like 95% of households can respond that way. About 60 to 70% of households probably actually have done that at this point in time. You know, there's no writing down things in boxes on a form. It's all online. The Census Bureau receives it electronically. They'll process it, you know, electronically, as they have done since 1890. And then most of us will never see, if there even will be print census volumes, they'll just be tabbed tables on a website and so on. So the entire census now is kind of computerized, and that's the process that Hollerith started off in 1890. So I'm going to kind of wrap up with the main part of the talk here, but I just wanted to kind of point out that what I've talked about today is just the kind of census through the lens of technology. And so like any technology story, that becomes a story of change. But the book itself actually looks at the census from different perspectives. So it's not just about technology, but about the politics of census taking, the way in which the census has been used to sort of oppress people and support tyranny, like in Nazi Europe. I have a chapter on that. The way in which people have protested against their governments through the census, and some biographical stories of some of the people involved in the census. So in that sense, the story that I've written is really like a broader story about the relationship between individuals on one hand, and then their governments or the societies that they live in on the other. And from that point of view, the census has a lot more continuity, right? The census that was taken in 1890 or 1790 or 1086 or, a couple of hundred years BCE is in some respects not so different from the census we take today, that the changes have been fairly few. And so to illustrate that, I just want to kind of leave you with two quotes. So one is from the Census Bureau website. I presume this is still on there. It certainly was a couple of months ago, which is explaining why we take the census, which is maybe a question that you've been wondering if you don't know much about the census. And so they say the census directs federal funds spent on schools, hospitals, roads, public works. Businesses use census data to decide where to build factories, offices, and stores. Developers use the census to build new homes and revitalize old neighborhoods. Local governments use the census for public safety and emergency preparedness. So like the census is really just helping us understand who everybody is, where they are, what some basic features about them. It's diffused through society in the way in which it's used. And I like to contrast this with a quote from 200 AD from a Chinese philosopher, Xu Gan, who's kind of, you know, a Confucian philosopher who's reflecting on the Chinese history of census taking. And he says, hence it is from population figures that a variety of affairs are derived, apportioning land for fields and dwelling areas, ordering the payment of tributes and taxes, manufacturing implements and utensils, regulating emoluments and salaries, raising numbers of people for hunting and corvée service, which is that kind of civic public works conscription, or conscripting troops for battalions and armies. He finishes with, does the significance of population figures then lie just in checking the numbers of people? And of course, my answer to that is no, it's much more significant. It really shapes the societies that we live in. It's a really important institution. And so my final ask, again, if you haven't yet responded to census, get online, straight off this talk, 2020census.gov, and do it. Yeah, happy to take questions.
Are we just taking questions from anyone at this point?
Yeah, I'm happy to take anybody's questions.
Okay, cool. Sometimes in the past, Renee has asked us to post the questions in the chat. So I was just making sure that wasn't our modus operandi this time. I was curious why it was called the Doomsday Book. And I did a bit of Googling, and it sounds like it's a little bit of a, religious and political issue where the people at the time thought a census was kind of a fateful thing, and they weren't sure if they liked it. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, so I speak a little bit about that in the book. Basically, and I mean, again, this ties into the technology thing. Basically, if you make a census and you write it down in a book, I mean, books are great in some ways, but you've written things on fixed pages, then you bind it together using some sort of ancient binding technique for parchment book, you know, codexes books, and you can't really edit it, right? Like it's you know, you have to unpick it all. You can make some minor changes to pages, but you don't have a lot of room to add and remove stuff. So the Domesday Book was basically out of date as soon as it was made. So in a certain sense, for one of the purposes, like for some of the administrative purposes it might have been created for, it actually didn't have a long history of use, maybe a couple of decades. But it was referred to for centuries afterwards to kind of establish old claims. So if you wanted to say, well, my family had this, you know, this parcel of land, and it was there before William the Conqueror and after William the Conqueror, you know, I mean, this is Britain, so people have kind of histories going back hundreds of years in terms of property ownership. So it was used for those purposes. And so not that long after it was produced, it kind of attained this, you know, it had been called other things. It had been called the Book of Winchester, which was where it was stored. But it pretty quickly attained this label of the Doomsday Book for this reason, that it was considered to be like a final pronouncement, you know, in a kind of biblical way on who owned what and that kind of thing. Yeah.
That's cool. I kind of forgot about the immutability of paper.
Yeah.
It's so easy to change data in Excel, for example.
Yeah. So I mean, the thing, and I'll move on to another question. So I don't want to spend too much time talking on this, but yeah. I mean, I also talk about the progression from kind of paper and books to card files, which are kind of an intermediate thing between, you know, paper or loose paper and Hollerith's idea of like a punch card. You have like a library card. I mean, it's not even a useful thing to say library card files now, because like practically nobody remembers library card files, but you know, like index cards arranged in drawers, and they have the advantage that you can change the order of them. You can make edits on them, but if you mess up and you want to just transcribe a card, it's just a matter of copying one card to a new one, putting it back in place, reordering. So it's like the way in which we developed like a flexibility of processing information, I think is really interesting, and it's like a thread in how the census has evolved. Yeah.
Thanks.
I got a couple of chat questions too, which I'll jump to. So Paul asked, you mentioned this, your second favorite character from the history of the census. What is your favorite? Man, I mean, I have slides in a different version of this talk about my favorite character. Yeah, he's a guy who was a census taker, sort of a census taker in Alaska. Ivan Petrov, and this was not long after the United States had purchased Alaska from Russia. And so Petrov might have been Russian, and his background is kind of murky, but he's basically this like 19th century rogue character. He apparently, he deserted from during the Civil War, he deserted from the US Army 3 times, so that he could sign up again and receive like a signing bonus that they had in action then. He had tried to be a journalist, I think on the West Coast, I think in San Francisco, but he kind of failed ignominiously out of that career because he was just making stuff up or plagiarizing or stuff like that. So eventually he comes to work on the census, and they say, oh, you sort of, he had some experience with Alaska, he may have come from there. So they said, go up to Alaska and tell us, tell us what's there. Like, what is this place that we just bought that's huge, this huge addition of land to the United States? Who are the people who live there? What is it like? What are its natural resources and stuff? So he traveled around there, and he sent these dispatches back to the census office in DC that are they're fascinating reading in that kind of like 19th century explorer way. Like he's canoeing upriver, and like he's got a couple of like native assistants, and a few people have died of diseases along the way. And like, it's got that kind of like interesting sort of insight into how census taking was happening that you don't always see in what is otherwise this kind of abstract character. But anyway, it turns out Petrov was making up a lot of stuff in Alaska as well. So eventually he kind of failed out of his census taking career as well. Well, he failed out of his kind of DC career because he was making stuff up in translation from Russian. Like this guy just couldn't do something honestly and correctly. And so you have these sort of 20th century historians who are saying, well, on one hand, Petrov, he told more lies than anybody else about Alaska. But at the same time, he's like this essential source of the early history of Alaska that we still rely on. So I like Petrov as being a kind of an anti-hero of census taking. I've got some other ones. So yeah, what are differences in measuring population data in developing countries versus countries like the US? So the biggest difference is that you generally have to physically go to people, right? So even if you have, increasingly, widespread access to cell phones and stuff like that, you have low literacy in some countries. So if you have 70% literacy or something like that, you can't rely on people to self-respond to the census. So you have a lot more of kind of enumerator interviews, which is the methodology the US Census used sort of up to the mid 20th century, and which it still uses in some places. So so I said that, the official response rate now is probably about 61%. I haven't checked the last couple of days. In reality, it's a little bit higher than that. But the people who don't respond to the census, eventually a census taker will come around and knock on your door, and they'll do a face-to-face interview if they have to. So that's a methodology which is kind of minority in the US, but in other countries, that's the main way that people collect on the census. There's other complexities. A lot of countries, it's much harder to get around, right, than it is in the US. You don't have a good road network. So census has become, I always say, like, censuses on the whole are much more about logistics than statistics. There's very little statistics in census taking, actually, but there's an awful lot of logistics of figuring out how do you cover off all the parts of the country. How do you know that you've seen every, you visit every household? So yeah, if you go back into the 20th century and earlier, census taking is this really complicated thing. Now, even in developing countries, it's a lot easier because you have places, everyone is using satellite imagery to see, well, are houses still where we thought they were? Are there new houses we have to go and inspect? So in the prologue of the book, I talk about going to the West Bank in Palestine and talking to those census takers, and that's they have a super interesting census because of the political, sensitivities in that part of the world. But yeah, they use tablets, they use satellite imagery to update their maps. Like the stuff they're doing is more advanced than what the US was doing in its census in 2010, apart from the kind of online self-response thing. Again, they're doing a lot more in-person enumeration. So that's probably the biggest difference. What is your opinion on current census practices? There are clearly some controversial topics such as questions about immigration. Broadly, what do you think should be changed or improved? Yeah, so the thing that we all thought was going to be the difficult and controversial thing about this census was the idea that the administration wanted to add a question about citizenship, which hadn't been on the census itself for many decades. So there's another survey called the American Community Survey, which is a sample survey. It asks a lot more questions. So a lot of the questions that were on, say, the 1890 census are now in some form on that sample. And that sample had asked about citizenship and has continuously, but we haven't asked everybody in the country about citizenship for a long time. And it was controversial. It was controversial because, like everything the current administration does, it was controversial because it was done in like a not particularly by the book kind of way. But it's a controversial question too, because the Census Bureau has been kind of progressively trying to pare down the census. So like I showed you on that punch card, the census now asks like somewhere around 7 questions, depending how you count it, of each person. And they're not really controversial questions. I mean, race and ethnicity can be a really controversial question, but in the US, it's kind of, it's pretty routinely gathered. People are kind of used to answering that on the question. They have done for decades. But there's definitely an aversion to putting stuff on the census that will make people not respond, because the way the census is tied into the Constitution and is then used for apportionment of Congress. It's used for also apportionment of the Electoral College for the presidential election. And also these days it's used for distributing funds. It makes the census a really politically important institution in the US. And so the most important thing in the US is to count everybody. And part of that question you asked, what can we change or improve? Well, there's been a sort of long discussion that's kind of bubbled up and disappeared again through the decades since maybe the 1970s about whether there should be more statistics used in the census. So more statistical technique, more reliance on sampling as a technique. But at the moment, legally, the census can't use sampling. So there's some sort of like imputation is done if the Census Bureau, knows somebody lives in a house, but it can't talk to that person. They'll do some statistical imputation, but essentially they have to sort of have specific knowledge of each person in order to include them in the census. Whereas there is this technique where you go out after a census, you take another sample survey and you can use that to figure out how accurate your first census was. Then you can adjust the figures to get a more accurate total. And there's some statistical justification to do that. And it has been argued multiple censuses, like certainly in 1990 and 2000, they argued about doing it that way. The courts pretty much ruled that they can't for now. So constitutionally, maybe they could. You would have to amend the law to do it. But that would be something that some countries certainly do. Many countries take this post-census survey just to measure accuracy, and then a bunch of countries will amend their figures to try and improve them in a statistical sense. It's not totally straightforward. There's definitely statistical arguments against doing it, but I think that would be the easiest thing to do. And it would make the census much cheaper, because at the moment, the Census Bureau has this sort of driving constitutional need to go out and count absolutely everybody, no matter how hard it might be to do. Whereas if you used a bit more sampling, a bit more statistics, sometimes you could just say, look, it's going to be too expensive to try and actually visit that household. We'll just use, a sample version to figure that out. So that's kind of controversial topics and improvements.
Follow up.
Yeah.
Were you implying earlier with the developing countries that instead of going in person, they're using a lot of sampling techniques through other kinds of data?
Usually not, actually. I mean, so it gets complicated because there are, most countries are doing a census. Some countries haven't. And I mean, not just what you might, depending on developing are like kind of tricky definitions, but like Lebanon is like a famous example of a country that hasn't done a census since the 30s because it has a kind of religious sectarian arrangement in its political representation. And so to actually count everybody and presumably also count people in religious groups would somehow upset that balance, right? So they actually kind of prefer not to know. But there they do there are still, it's not like we don't know the population of Lebanon. We pretty much do know. They have sample surveys and other things that you can use to figure that out. It's not probably as accurate as a full census would be. But no, most countries don't do a sample. There's some interesting, I talk a bit about how in South Africa before the end of apartheid, they actually did do this kind of mixed census and sample-based estimation of population. And that was in part because there were parts of South Africa that the white census taker representative of government, the townships, they didn't want to go in there, like particularly in 1990, they were kind of violent places. There was a campaign of violent resistance to the apartheid regime. And so instead of that, they would sort of, you can think of ways that you would do this, right? Like you'd sample a bunch of houses, you figure out how many people lives in the average house, then you fly over it, you take aerial photos and you count the number of houses.
Yeah.
It works okay. I spoke to somebody who worked on that census and he was like, it's actually like methodologically, it's not that bad. It's just that if you're counting the white people by going around and interviewing their house, you're perpetuating this inequality in how the state relates with people, which is kind of offensive, I think. But yeah, most countries will make an effort to actually count people. France, I think, is the only country that has moved back to woods. They have a kind of complicated rolling sampling sort of thing. But yeah, most countries do actually count people.
I have a question. Unless you're still doing that.
Go for it. Yeah, there are some as well.
I missed the first like 15 minutes of your talk. I see very well we just talked about this. So I know Josh Blumenstock at Berkeley. If you know his work, like he's done a lot of stuff around like estimating censuses of places that I think he's definitely done, like Afghanistan and places that they haven't done in like 40 years, and like using CDRs. I guess is that something that you know much about or talk much about or see viability?
Yeah. Yeah, so I did what you missed in like the first minute of the talk was where I was saying, yeah, I like at the World Bank when I met Kathy, I worked on some of that stuff. Like actually we did work with Josh briefly, I think at least on one thing, and certainly he spoke at some events for us and stuff like that. Yeah, and so we worked on CDRs and we worked on satellite imagery, being like two of the sort of big data types that are like broadly available, because there's like, you know, there's a ton of stuff that's interesting. Like it's really cool to get location data that comes from apps on people's phones, whatever you can buy from private providers, but it means nothing in a country where smartphone penetration is not that high, right? And I was doing this like 5 years ago now, so you know, these things are always improving. And even call detail records have that problem, right? Not everybody has a phone. So the idea of census taking is really to try and capture everybody and create the kind of you know, ground truth, which you can then use to apply other things to understand. So it doesn't really solve the problem of like a basic census, I don't think. But there's certainly people have done some innovative things in places where it's just not possible to get somebody on the ground to go around and count every house or every person, every house. Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to jump ahead to another one. Sorry, someone?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say the one about does census always have to be top down? Other examples of communities aggregating census data for themselves to amplify their own voice or present a unified view to leaders. Yeah, that's super interesting. So it doesn't. My book is kind of tracing back from the history of like the census taking infrastructure we have today. So in that sense, it really focuses on like national censuses and the closest things to those before we had sort of modern nation states. But there are certainly examples of like cities taking censuses. So even in the US, right, I spoke about the 1890 census. One of the things they were able to draw on in terms of learning was that there was an 1885 census of Massachusetts. There are censuses, there was a census, I don't remember which year, but there was a census where they lost the entire results of, I think, all of California or some part of California. I don't know, like I think this was before the Panama Canal. And so the ship that was carrying them sank or whatever, you know, these things happen in census taking. And so they just didn't have the data, but they were able to go back and use a state census from earlier to kind of add that numbers in. So it wasn't as bad as it could have been. So there certainly have been censuses and still are censuses that happen at smaller scales than the nation. Yeah, and they can be aggregated up. Census to amplify people's own voice. Yeah, I mean, I think you see this kind of thing, right? So one thing I find really fascinating is the way in which censuses classify people by race or ethnicity or you know, national origin and stuff like that. And you get this, I mean, I really feel for the census takers who have to decide what questions go on the census here, because you'll get, even for like the same ethnic group, you'll get some people who say, well, we would really like, for instance, in the 2020 census, Arabic and North African to be a racial group, which will be included on the census, which it isn't, and it wasn't in 2020, but there was a campaign to do that. But you can imagine in just about in any group of people you can think of, there's also a group of people who say, no, we definitely do not want that thing to be on there. We know that like the US Census has some historical instances of census data being used to target groups of people. So we'd rather that information not be collected. So there's always this kind of push and pull as to whether like a self-identifying group wants to be recorded in the official data. You know, it has the advantage that you can point to the census data then and say, well, we have this many people, so we should get, you know, funding for religious institutions if that's something that a country has, or we should get, you know, representation, or generally you should understand that we exist and want a voice. So official censuses are used in that way. And I think you also see examples. I mean, people, certainly like organizations, groups of people will you know, amass their numbers and use that to show that they should have some kind of political voice. Those things happen for sure too, yeah. One thing I didn't really get to in the book, but I was wondering a lot. My conclusion is kind of like, you know, the future of census taking, privacy, Facebook, all these kinds of issues, right? And one thing I was really trying to think through was like, you know, how, and this like leans a little bit towards anarchism, but I don't mean in that way, but like how much can a government actually function without knowing who it's governing, right? In some sense. So I mean, the idea of a census is that you at least have a kind of aggregate numerical sense of like, who are you governing? How many people are in New York? How many people in California? How many people are in whatever, Tennessee? Can you really run us this? And the census, by the way, is like the least privacy intrusion that we have in society today. Like the IRS knows way more about you than the Census Bureau. and so like modern society is just a whole bunch of databases that governments have about the people that they govern. But I think it's kind of an interesting question as to whether you could construct a society or construct a governed state where the government didn't really have that personalized information on people. And it seems pretty hard, to be honest. But it's an interesting kind of thought experiment.
I have a question. Can you talk a bit more about like the process of writing the book, right? So like, how did you end up at this point? You like had an idea and then what?
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of weird because I'm not a historian at all. Like my background is computer science and economics and statistics, and I kind of ended up writing a book about history effectively, which was not necessarily how I thought about it when I went in. So I had been thinking about writing this book since the previous round of censuses. So yeah, censuses across the world tend to happen in like the 0 and 1 years. So 2010, 2011 is the bulk of censuses. 2020, 2021 will be the next bulk of censuses every 10 years. And that's like got a long historical story as to why those years as well. So in the 2010, 2011 round of censuses, I was like, there's just a lot of interesting stories intersect with this, right? So like the story of Hollerith that I briefly talked about, which is like, you know, it's not the invention of the computer, because what he was working with were not computers in like a technical sense, but it's definitely the invention of kind of like information processing as we think about it now. And so the idea that like the census led to this thing, which, you know, like dominates our lives now, I find interesting. The way in which the census interacts with a lot of like historical stories and myths that we know about ourselves, I found really interesting. I just came across more and more examples of people who had kind of been involved in census taking, like this guy Petrov that I told you about from Alaska, whose stories are interesting. So I thought, well, there's kind of a book in this, but I was in the middle of doing a PhD on like a totally different sort of mathematical statistics topic then. So I kind of just like collected all these notes gradually and put them aside and didn't think about it. And then for like complicated personal reasons to do with immigration status, and my wife got a job in New York and stuff like that, I found myself separated from the World Bank for a little bit. And it was just at the time where I was like, I think if I sort of seriously commit to this book now, I can probably get it published in time for the 2020 US Census, which is like the one big marketing opportunity you get every decade to write a book on the census. So I was like, if I'm going to write this book, it would be dumb for it to come out like in April 2021 when everyone's forgotten about the census. Like it better come out in April 2020. Not knowing that COVID would be the only thing people were talking about in April 2020. Yeah, so that was like a couple of years, like maybe 2 years before publication. And I wrote, I started writing some chapters. In the nice thing about writing a nonfiction book is in the like, and I wasn't sure whether I would go with like a traditional trade publishing route or like an academic publisher or kind of quasi-academic thing, or like maybe even self-publishing. But and in the end, it's like it's a trade book. The publisher is Basic Books, who does trade nonfiction books. But the nice thing about that world is that you don't have to write the whole book before you pitch it to a publisher. So with a couple of chapters and a sort of a detailed proposal, you can sell the book to a publisher. I pitched it to a bunch of agents first. A couple of them were interested. One I signed up to, and then the agent pitched it to a bunch of publishers. Eventually, not a huge number were interested, to be honest. It's a niche topic. I think it's always a risk when a publisher's taking a risk on a book as to whether it will find an audience or not, and it's not obvious with a book like this whether it will or won't. But Basic Books did, and so once I had that in place, then it was like that created a deadline and so on, and then it was just like pressure to get the thing written, which was partly assembling notes I already had, but mostly doing like new research. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so I guess like a follow-up question on that, right, is where's the best place to buy your book, right? Do you get like a different cut depending where it's distributed?
No, I do get like a slightly different cut from the ebook versus the paper hardcover as it is right now book versus the audio book, I presume. So it's available ebook and paper, physical book and audio book. It doesn't matter. It doesn't actually matter to me whether you buy it from Amazon or your local bookshop. I mean, I buy a ton of books from Amazon, but also I really want to support local bookshops, which are all closed at the moment and, you know, struggling to try and stay alive when people can't. Because I mean, they really survive on like people walking past and walking in and enjoying the atmosphere and buying a book. And nobody can do that at the moment, really. So yeah, there are websites where you can buy books from like a local bookstore near you. If you go to thesumofthepeople.com, so the sum of the people, the book title.com, that's my like book website, and there's links there you can go to.
You mentioned a handful of technical innovations that came out of census work. I'm curious if most of those innovations felt like they were coming kind of top down from the government. So the government says, hey, we need to improve the census, let's go make technology. Or if you saw them coming bottom up, if it was a private individual who just happened to make something useful for the census.
Yeah, there's a mix of both, because I mean, this is kind of like broad outlines, but so much of the census development happens in the 19th century. And so the interest, I think, of the state interest in the 19th century, like by then it had kind of moved on from this conscription taxation thing that had like been the dominant reason for census taking much earlier. But it wasn't yet a sort of, it wasn't necessarily a kind of open-minded scientific inquiry about people. You know, the US Census really was instituted for a specific purpose of tying representation to population and taxation to population too originally, although that kind of fell into disuse. So in that sense, the top-down thing was kind of narrow and limited, but there were like a ton of enthusiasts basically who wanted to collect more information is my understanding of it. So, I mean, even, you know, like James Madison, even in the first census, wanted to ask more information about people. So, you know, the Constitution, as it was unamended in 1790 at the first census, only required that you ask whether somebody was essentially a free person, an enslaved person, or in some cases Native American. Like, and the free people were counted 1, the enslaved people were counted famously as 3/5, and Native Americans who weren't taxed were not counted. So in a sense, they, you know, you just needed to exclude them. But they were really the only categories, the only distinctions that census had to make. And yet they still asked these things like age, and Madison wanted to add occupation as well. So there was always a push from people through the 19th century to kind of add statistical information. So the census kind of grows up with the development of statistics as a profession. So really in like 1800, there wasn't something called statistics like we know it now. It wasn't this kind of mathematical application of you know, application of maths to data, basically to draw understanding. That kind of developed statistical societies like the ASA and the RSS in the UK and stuff came about in kind of the 1830s. And so you have this like groundswell of people who are kind of professionalizing the way that we, and kind of, you know, adding a kind of mathematical underpinning to how we think about data, about society. And so they had a lot of influence as well in asking that new questions be asked, in like that transition that I kind of spoke about, where the census went from being this kind of like wide form subtotal based thing to this long form thing. That was, I think, instituted mostly by pressure from like professional statisticians became involved in thinking about the census. So a lot of those, yeah, a lot of the innovations did, I think, come from like outside government. The innovations that came from inside government were probably more about you know, some of the sort of logistical things, some of the, I mean, there's a whole other story of how you sort of have census taking paralleling population registers, which I have a chapter about, like I said, about Nazi Europe, which is kind of this kind of height of using card files of people to track individual citizens. And so, you know, although we like to think that doesn't exist anymore, that kind of still does exist in lots of forms, like in a lot of these kind of government, in IRS's database or driver licensing databases or whatever. We maybe don't have a single database of everyone in the US, which was like the dream of these early 20th century people. But so like a lot of those sort of innovations, if you like, did come from kind of top-down government as a kind of mechanism of control.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question on behalf of a participant, which is, what do you think about the current practice of felons being counted in a census but not being able to vote? Like, don't practices like that effectively shift voting power in a district to the people who can vote in that district?
Yeah, so I mean, it's well, there's I mean, there's two parts to that, right? One is the disenfranchisement, and I mean, I personally think everybody should be able to vote. So I mean, it's complicated to think where people should vote. I mean, the problem is, right, you have a large group of people in a prison that like swells the population of a local area, but they're not really part of that local area in like an effective sense. They're not like, you know, they're not going to the shops in that area. They're not using the schools in that area. You maybe wouldn't want, I don't know how big prisons are, but huge in this country, right? You wouldn't want everybody in prison being able to vote necessarily in like a small area where they would dominate the vote. Like I can understand, although I don't agree with like disenfranchisement of, well, you mean fell into a post-prison, or like, because the term is kind of ambiguous in America, right? We mean people in prison at the time.
I think post-prison.
Well, post-prison's, yeah, I mean, again, like then I definitely think everyone should be able to vote. So that's that, right? I mean, there are other categories of people who count in the census but can't vote, like me. I have a green card. You know, as long as I'm living here on some status, or in fact on no status, I still should count for the census. According to the history and the legal interpretation, I still wouldn't be able to vote. So there's categories of that, but no, I mean, I don't know. I'm pro enfranchising people in general. There's a more nuanced issue that comes up a lot with the census, which is that people in prison are counted where the prison is located, which kind of adds numerical weight to particular districts, and so then those districts get more, effectively more representation in both. I mean, maybe not at federal level or as large numbers, but certainly at state levels and so on. Despite the fact that those people don't themselves vote, so it adds weight to the vote of all of the non-imprisoned people in that same district.
Exactly.
That's yeah. So that's
systematically imprison people,
right?
Perhaps like
and
that's one way to enforce.
Right, exactly, and it's like it has a really awful resonance with the Free First Compromise, because that had the same effect of adding numerical power to the slaveholding states, even though those people who were enslaved in those states didn't get to vote. I mean, not that many people got to vote in the beginning, right? I mean, you're talking about like propertied men, really. So like the whole question of enfranchisement is complicated early in the history of the United States. But certainly, I think this idea that you had a large group of people who added to the political power of like Southern male slaveholders by virtue of how they were counted in the census, the way that resonates with the issue of how prisoners are counted in prisons today, and the like racial disparities in that, I think is really like one of the reasons that it is such a prominent issue for activists, is that it really echoes like a historical injustice. One thing I will say is it's like there's two threads. There's one is like how the census actually counts people and where they count people, and then there's like how do the districting authorities in a given state or local area make their districting decisions. So my understanding is the Census Bureau now provides like data files that allow individual authorities to include those prisoners or not, depending on, they can make their own decisions. And I mean, a lot of these districting decisions will be challenged in courts and so on. So there's also legal constraints to what they can do. But my impression is that in principle, individual districting authorities can make a decision not to use prisoners to kind of inflate the weight of political representation in a particular area. I don't know how common it is. Yeah, I mean, you can understand with the Census Bureau why they, they have to make a rule about where prisoners count. In theory, maybe you could ask everybody where they were living before they were in prison. Is it different if you're in prison for 6 months versus 10 years? There's a lot of like technical questions. So I think the answer of just like breaking those people out so that individual authorities can make decisions is probably the best one. And then you kind of shift the burden away from the Census Bureau, which ideally is not a political institution, right? Like it should be relatively apolitical, and you push that responsibility onto individual, authorities to decide how they want to district things. Doesn't mean they'll make the right decision, of course, but
Yeah. Okay. I see. Thanks.
Yeah. Anything else?
I think we're at time. So thanks so much for speaking to us.
Well, thanks for inviting me. If anyone has any questions, I have a website, you have an email address for me and stuff like that. So I'm always happy to answer questions about the census. If you haven't done the census, go do the census, 2020census.gov. It takes like 5 minutes. And it's kind of fun.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.